So next, I would like to introduce the second keynote speaker, Craig Parkok. As a head of BECA design practice, Mr. Parkok has been active in New Zealand, Australia, Palestine, India, and the United States. He has emphasized the responsibility of landscape architects to mitigate climate change, as he has been working on a low-carbon design for the last 18 years. He has also presented various types of design from regional projects, such as planning urban growth and earthquake recovery initiatives, to inclusive community art projects. It's time to have the second keynote speaker, Craig Pocock. Please give him a big round of applause.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Araki te Monga, ko Raka te Awa, ko George Pocock te Puni, no Otatahi aho Aotearoa ahau, ko Craig Pocock tōku ingoa. So my name is Craig Pocock, and I'm a landscape architect from New Zealand. And in New Zealand, when we identify ourselves to new informal crowds, we identify where we're from, the mountain that we were born under, the river that we were close to. And what makes it really awesome to be a landscape architect in New Zealand is that we're tied to the land. Our actual identity on who we are and how we're recognized is tied to the landscape. It's also an awesome place to work. There's lots of water, rivers, lakes, lots of green stuff, mountains, good productive soil, and a government that supports landscape architecture within its policies. So it's an awesome place to work, and I spent the first 3 years of my career as a young landscape architect way back in the early 90s working in New Zealand and enjoying the benefits of, I guess, living in a pretty forgiving country from a landscape architectural perspective. But after a little while, I got itchy feet, and I kind of wanted to see how the rest of the world looked at design. I wanted to understand what a different design perspective might look like. And so I started traveling. And my next job I got was in a place called Jordan. Jordan is everything that New Zealand is not. Jordan didn't have a lot of topsoil. It had no real forests. It had only a couple of small rivers. It was the diametric opposite to anything I knew from a landscape architecture perspective. But it was old, and there was this culture there and these cities there that were fabulous. And so I took it on. I just thought it was going to be an interesting experience. I'm a young guy, you know, what could happen? And so my job as a New Zealand landscape architect used to water was to landscape the desert. And it just wasn't any desert. It was firstly a five-star hotel project. I wasn't the designer on it, but I was the project manager. So my job was to make it work. So the design work came in from American and UK firms, and I was the only landscape architect on the job to make this work. To put that in perspective, if you could think of the most inhospitable landscape for trying to make anything work from a landscape architectural perspective, the Dead Sea's that, right? It is hot, it's dusty, it's rock. There is no soil as such, no developed soil, hadn't rained for over 8 years. Just to add into the mix, as the Dead Sea had retreated from the soil line, it had left a layer of salt across the land. I don't know if anyone's tried to grow things in salt, but it doesn't work so well. But somehow, over the course of a year, we made it work. We planted a landscape around a hotel. We planted this oasis in the desert to support this economic driver that was a hotel. What I become uncomfortable with is how we achieved it. I had never thought about this before, but the way we did this is we didn't have soil. So we took trucks and we drove them up to northern Jordan, where there was some of the few farmable soils left in the country, and we took that soil. And we drove it all the way down from almost the northern border of Syria, almost all the way down to the Dead Sea, and we laid it across the landscape. We then planted our 300,000 plants, right? 300,000 plants in a place that had nothing like that from a biodiversity perspective, that wasn't supposed to have this landscape. This landscape doesn't fit with this environment. And it hadn't rained for 8 years. And so this landscape required 80 cubic meters of water a year to live, right? And it was the first hotel that had been done on the Dead Sea on the Jordanian side. And even though I was not the designer, I was the project manager from a landscape perspective, and I worked out how to do it. And part of me should be really proud, but most of me was horrified, because with that success in the yellow spaces where the hotel was, with that success came duplication. And not just duplication of hotels and economic well-being, but duplication of landscape damage. By the time I left after 1 year, the new hotels were already underway, and they were talking about damming the Wadi Munjab River, one of really only 2 major rivers in the whole country, to supply water to hotels. And there was this moment, right, that, I'd just gone through 4 years of landscape education. I'd done this work in New Zealand that was, community and environmentally focused, and there was wetlands and playgrounds, and it was all this sort of feel-good stuff. And in my mind, landscape architecture was always here from an environmental perspective. We were the guardians of environment. And I just realized that as a landscape architect, we can do just as much environmental damage as we can do good. And it changed my life. And I think coming from New Zealand, I don't think I ever would have seen it. Not until you go to harsh environments that lack resources do you truly understand what it means to deliver sustainable designs. If you try sustainable outcomes in countries with good soil and good water and good plants and well-established industry, it's not hard to succeed. But it's the tough landscapes that really teach us the lessons. So I was disillusioned, and I left Jordan, and I went to the West Bank. And it was another hotel. And this time the hotel was called the Jasa Palace, and it was in Bethlehem. So I got to live in Bethlehem. So for me, I was on an adventure. But the reason why I accepted this one is that this hotel was all around social and economic development for the Palestinian people. It wasn't about the landscape. It wasn't about creating a fancy resort on the Dead Sea. It was about social economic income for the people and changing the way the Palestinian people were perceived. And I was like, I can get on board with this. This is interesting. And so I spent a year living in Bethlehem doing this project. It succeeded. The hotel got built. It got shut down about 3 months before the opening due to conflict. But it eventually opened, and it's still running today. But it was the first time I really learned that landscape architecture is not just about aesthetics and about ecological systems. It's about social and economic well-being. I never thought of that before. After that, I went to India, and I was working in New York and India at the same time. And we had this very big, large project in India called Shilam. And it was just fascinating. It did a whole lot of stuff. There was a whole lot of ecological stuff that was happening with it, and community building stuff and all the rest. But the one thing that I thought was fascinating is there was a direct connection between water, education, and landscape architecture. So as the village wells went dry in midsummer, the kids got taken out of school to carry water. And in the landscape, if we could slow down the water velocity, we could recharge the water wells naturally, and the kids could stay in school. I had never considered the idea that landscape architecture could be a tool for prolonging education. I spent a bit of time in New York. Someone mentioned the Brooklyn Bridge Park. It is one of my favorites. And New York's a fabulous city. It's a big city. And if you really want to see innovation, New York had innovation. And I don't think it was, well, all right, I should be careful what I say here. It's not because I think they were the most talented. What I thought was interesting about New York is the EDC, or the people that handed out the projects, required a high level of sustainability to be added to their projects. And so this was the first environment or consultancy environment I'd ever walked into where each consultancy, they had their own research arms. So the consultants were doing their own research to try and stay ahead of the market to meet the client's expectations to high levels of sustainability. And I was like, that's really interesting, because it means that we can change the way we behave if the client asks us to behave in a certain way. There's some power there. So I thought this was all really interesting. It was also the first time I heard the word carbon. And it was an engineer calculating out a facade of a building. I thought, if you can do that for a building, I wonder if you can do that for a landscape. And I just sort of put that idea to the side, didn't think about it again. So I came back to New Zealand about a decade later. So what initially was going to be a 2-year jaunt went on for a decade, traveled around the world, worked, got exposed to a whole lot of new ideas, and thought it was fascinating, and I kind of wanted to share these ideas. It's like, other people want to hear about this, right? And so I talked about the social and the economic and the different aspects of what landscape architecture can bring to the table beyond what we normally consider. And somehow in those conversations, somewhere, and it was during a speech, I think in 2004, I mentioned the fact that, by the way, there's probably a carbon impact to what we do. I didn't think too much more of it, but that's where I got the kickback. By the time I made that statement, about 5 days later, a week later, I had 5 formal letters of complaint to the NZILA. And I'm like, we're onto something. We touched a nerve here. I would have let it go. I wouldn't have even thought about it. I would have focused on social economic. I think there's a whole lot of other stuff that's much more interesting than carbon, but it hit something. And I was like, And so one of the letters says this, look, there's no significant amount of carbon in what we do, and even if there was, all the trees we plant offset it. I guess that's kind of logical. So, because I'm older than most of you, well, maybe some of you, we have paper plans. We used to have these bottom drawers, you'd pull you get these big heavy plans out and you drop them on the table. And so I spent a week with a Lincoln University student going through those plans and measured up the 4 major materials I used in designs: asphalt, timber, steel, and concrete. Now, there were some basic carbon calculators around back in the early 2000s that allowed us to do that. There was a calculator by British Airways around flights, and there was a basic calculator around some office time. So I threw some carbon stuff in there around my office and my flights. But you can see, if you look at those numbers, concrete was by far the biggest thing. And concrete's this wonderful material that we use, and we use it a lot. And that was my carbon footprint. I came back with a carbon footprint of almost 16,000 tons of carbon in 14 years of career. And to be honest, it'd been a pretty average career. If you look at, what are we talking about here? Some playgrounds, some reserves, a bridge, nothing particularly, large urban plazas like we've seen. But I thought, all right, well, it doesn't matter because I've planted a hell of a lot of trees. And so I did a rough calculation based on reforestation we did in New Zealand and India. And in both cases, I helped set up the nurseries, so I had a rough idea how many trees we planted. So I planted out all these trees, and there was a Canadian research paper that gave us the sequestering value of trees. There was one paper. Now I can find about 15, but in 2005, there was nothing. So thank God to these Canadians. So 54,000 trees offset 500 tons. So I'm still in trouble. It gives me a carbon debt right, of 15,500 tons, which is about 1,100 tons of carbon every year from my personal debt for the material that I specified, only for materials, not detailed, really back of a piece of paper sketch. This is conservatively low. So I thought, so I thought this was kind of interesting, and I thought, well, maybe I should tell someone else. So we scraped together an airfare. I was a young guy, and we flew to Kuala Lumpur, and I presented this at the Kuala Lumpur World Congress back in '77. Showed them my numbers. And it was two things happened. I presented to the crowd, and no one asked a single question. And I thought I completely wasted my time. And then at the afternoon tea, someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Can you present your entire paper again?" And I think it's in the history of World Congresses, it's the only time a session paper has been presented twice at a Congress. And so clearly, it was a really new idea, but a challenging idea, and they wanted to hear it twice. There were still no questions in the second session. What was interesting is by the time I got on the airplane and got back home, there was a letter of complaint from the concrete industry of New Zealand, from the CEO, plus the academics. I had a head of one of the universities written to me and said, "This can't be true." And the American Society of Landscape Architects had written in their editorial that this cannot possibly be true. I was like, well, I'm really onto something now. And I get it, right? It makes it. I mean, landscape architects are really cool. You think about what we do. You know, we're building communities, we're enhancing environments, we're making these incredible landscapes, we're sensitive people, we're environmentally driven. We're amazing. But the challenging bit was that bit, because we're amazing, but what happens when you add up the embodied energy or the carbon cost of what we do? If you slide that in onto the calculation, does the climate impact of what we do outweigh the ecological good that we're doing? Because it doesn't matter if we're saving some birds and putting some water into the ground over here through swales if we're burning the planet over here. And so I get that that was an uncomfortable conversation, and it becomes even more uncomfortable if you don't think about this as projects, but you start thinking about whole landscape networks, whole citywide landscapes like we were just seeing. If you start calculating out the carbon cost of maintaining those things, where do we sit? And so it got me in a lot of trouble for about a decade. So just to give you an idea of the scale of the problem, so apparently there's 300 of you, right? And clearly maybe not all of you are in this room, but there are 300 landscape architects registered for this World Congress. So if I take your number and multiply it by my number of 1,100 tons of carbon, it means that you guys collectively have a carbon footprint of 330,000 tons. It's cool, you can plant your way out of it. It's just going to take you about 36 million trees. And the problem with planting trees is you need space. And so to plant your 36 million trees to offset 1 year of your collective work, you'd have to plant a forest about twice as big as Seoul, and that is at forestry plantation scale. Trees 1 meter apart. And this is the problem. It's as simple as this. I can't draw it any simpler than this. Fundamentally, the embodied energy of the materials that we use and we specify is so heavy in carbon that our poor little natural environment can never succeed to offset it. And not in the way that we're running through carbon. And this is not new, right? Beyond 2000, I mean, that's, it's 22 years ago. This is not a new idea. It just hadn't really been applied to landscape so much. So I'm not going to explain the carbon cost of materials. I don't have time to do that. All you need to know is that there is an internationally accepted method or equation for understanding the environmental footprint of a material, whether it's stainless steel, concrete steel, doesn't matter, timber. There's lots of information sitting around. In New Zealand, we use brands and ISCA. But in short, all you need to understand is the more something's processed, the higher the carbon footprint. The less it's processed, the lower the carbon footprint. So you could imagine crushed gravel has a different and lower carbon footprint than that of concrete. Now I'm just going to stop because people hear me talking about carbon a lot, and what I want to be really clear about is when I talk to you about the carbon impact of landscape architecture, I just use that as one measure. We are responsible for a massive amount of pollution that goes into our environment. Every time you specify concrete, these are the other things that go into our environment. These are the environmental profiles. So I talk to carbon because it's an easy measure to show the degree of impact. The other thing you'll see is I'll talk about trees, and I do not talk about trees as a solution. I talk about trees so you can understand the scale of the issue. Because when I first started having these conversations 18 years ago, I would talk about the carbon impact, and people were like, so what? What does that mean? I don't even see it. How do I explain that? And I use trees now to explain it. It works excellently for engineers. They get it. So, let's talk about where our carbon issues sit, okay? So I'm not going to talk about design. Like, you can run as much hybrid cars as you want and electric vehicles. You can get low-powered light bulbs. It ain't saving us. The carbon cost of what you are responsible for sits in the implementation and detailed design of the materials we use. Right? It's in the construction and the design of our landscapes. And what makes it difficult to see that carbon is two things. One is that often our landscapes look really green. So you don't even look for carbon in a place that looks really green. It doesn't make sense. You know, you look at a steel bridge and you think, oh yeah, there's got to be some carbon over there. But you look at a reserve and you're like, oh yeah, it's a nice lawn. So not only do we struggle to see carbon because of the way our stuff looks, we don't see what's happening below the ground. And the answer to the carbon impact of what we do is often below the ground. Let me show you. So this is a piece of research work we did, I don't know, about a year ago. And it really came about because a guy that wanted, a supplier wanted to sell me cut stone, and to show me how cool his cut stone, he took me to a site, put my hard hat on and the fluoro, took me to a site where they were building rain gardens and they were using his stone, and it was the first time I got to see the profile of a rain garden, and for this rain garden. And if you can see, and there's not a good scale there, but if you can see within that circle, there is 1/2 meter of reinforced concrete with a steel edge with 80 mil stone epoxy resin on top of, with an entire secondary stormwater system built into the rain garden. And I'm looking at this, I'm like, whew, holy hell, that's interesting. So what I did is we simply wanted to see how interesting this was. So we basically collected 6 different rain gardens. We did an analysis based on 100 square meters, which is a 10 by 10 meter area. It's about half the size of this stage. And we worked out the carbon impact. And the way we did that is we built a 3-dimensional model of that landscape to scale, and we exploded it, not literally. We exploded it, and we worked out the carbon cost of each one of those layers that makes up that landscape, all the way down to the AP40, the base course. You can get a carbon cost for base course. And then because we had very accurate carbon numbers and quantities, we could actually run a QS across them and get the financial numbers at the same time. And so we created a little carbon speedo there in the sort of middle, and in the bottom there's a cost. So not only did we have a little picture of the rain garden, we knew what it was going to cost us from a carbon perspective, and we knew what it was going to cost us from a financial perspective. The middle diagram was for my engineers, who sometimes need a little bit more help. The red square on that map is 100 square meters to scale in the area of the rain garden. The yellow square is the size of reforestation you have to plant to offset the red square. So in this case, what I like to think of the frugal rain garden, so it had the highest performance but lowest carbon cost. You had to plant 89 trees to offset that design. And you needed about 0.3 of a hectare. But when you went up to the more carbon heavy, we were looking at 16 tons of carbon per 100 square meters of urban design. We were looking at 1,783 trees to offset 100 meters. You need almost 6 hectares of land. God is in the details. Carbon is in the details. And I found this out. I didn't know which way this was going to go. I realized this was the outcome, so just to continue the dialogue, I took it to the Engineering Water Conference. I got out, but it was a good conversation, robust conversation. I guess the point I want to make is your carbon footprint sits in the pen that you hold, the line and the cross-section and how you draw and the amount of hard surfaces you allocate. Your drawing as a designer has a carbon impact. Imagine your ink being a carbon calculator. Carbon sits in how we design. And we've got to really question how we design if we are building infrastructure for climate change adaptation that's causing climate change. There's probably a problem. All right, so we've talked about implementation and I've only talked about materials. What I have not calculated and would like to calculate one day, and probably will on the next large streetscape project, is I want to calculate out the amount of fossil fuels it takes to build a landscape, right? So these numbers that I'm showing you still are conservatively low because it does not include the fuel that we build landscapes with. So, if there's a massive carbon impact in our landscapes, and we need to design these landscapes, and we need people to enjoy them, but that's where the cost sits, then we do not want to replace them. Urban renewal is not our friend. Urban renewal is just carbon compounding debt. So, for example, Cathedral Square, the carbon cost of rebuilding Cathedral Square in 1974, only to rip it out in 2007 and rebuild the whole place again. The carbon debt from 1974 would not have even been paid off by the time we were ripping it out and starting again. And I thought this was kind of interesting, so I started looking into our awards, and I started finding the top landscapes that had won awards over the last 3 or 4 decades, because back in the old days, they printed them in magazines, so it was easy to find out. Every year's awards were listed off. What I discovered was the average life expectancy of a landscape project often was in 20 to 30 years. Right, that's an environmental disaster. If our landscapes are only lasting 3 decades and we haven't paid off the carbon cost and we're buying more carbon, we have a major problem. What's interesting is that the reasons for failure often was material, so which you're responsible for, right? So material selection and detailing was one of the reasons why spaces got pulled out, and you're 100% responsible for that. But dated pattern making. There was a portion, I think, in the 90s where landscape architecture was having a bit of a heyday, and we were designing with patterns and colors and this craziness all over the place. You know, the mid-90s, we had leaping trouts and we had islands and grapes designed into our streetscapes because that's what we thought was cool. Well, 2010, they didn't date that well. So the things that had pulled out these landscapes were either material failure or just very dated landscapes. There are a few other things, but they really were the first two. As I said, I lived in Bethlehem, and it got me thinking. I've worked in India, I've lived in the Middle East. And there are landscapes there. I remember walking through Jerusalem and realizing that the paving that I was walking over was centuries old, that there were whole generations of people walking across this landscape. How do they differ from the ones that we're pulling out? How are they different? Well, they're durable, right? Material selection, stone, the compression strength of stone and the wearability is easily listed in centuries. Simple patterns, if not no patterns, people made the interesting part of the space, not what was happening on the ground. And the spaces were kept really simple. They weren't over-prescribed from a design perspective. You know, and if you kind of want to know if you've got an urban renewal problem, right, look around your city and find me spaces that are 100 years old. Because if you're struggling to find spaces that are 100 years old or 70 years old or 50 years old, you probably have a urban renewal problem. So, to avoid the compounding interest, because, you know, we sell design. We like design, we get to express ourselves, get to be called, get to go into magazines and win awards. We like design and we make money from it. And so when a client comes to us and says, I want to update a park that's quite worn down and, you know, the community aren't engaging with it as much, our first reaction should be to test that space. I've been to some pretty grimy spaces that are pumping full of people, packed, loving life. And so I think before we pay the carbon debt of pulling out landscapes, we should test the viability of those spaces with a year of social and event programming. Not only would we learn how those spaces perform, we might also learn that we don't need to pull out the space. We might need to just do a small edit. And that would save us a hell of a lot of time, money, and carbon. And I would argue, as a marketing guy, it's a new service to sell. Landscape architects should be driving social and event programming in public spaces, and you shouldn't be delivering brand new public spaces without it. If you want to see some really good examples, I was on the very, very much on the fringe of the Brooklyn Bridge Design Group, so I've always had a soft spot for it, particularly from an embodied energy perspective, from a reuse. It's a very clever project. But what it also does really clever is social programming. And what I really love about this social programming is I love, you know, speed dating. Speed dating in the park. Who can't love that? Beach karaoke. So we should be testing our open spaces out with programming. Another really good place to get a feel for it is Christchurch, gapfiller.org.nz. So Christchurch went through a horrendous earthquake in 2010. We lost almost all our public spaces, almost our entire inner city fell down. And yet we still needed to, and we still were living that way 12 years on. But what happened was we worked out how we created minimal new intervention and good social programming to make those spaces come back to life without making the investment into renewal. So it's possible. All right, so we've talked about the cost of what we build. We want to avoid the urban renewal. The last piece is carbon maintenance. And carbon maintenance, this is the problem. When you look at these pictures and these big green areas, you think, oh, come on, Craig, there can't be any carbon there. But the thing with carbon maintenance is because of the way you've designed a park, it comes with a maintenance requirement. And that requirement goes on forever and ever and ever for the life cycle of that park. So you're designing in the carbon debt that that park will take from a maintenance perspective forever and a day. And if you're designing really well, it should be a century. So when you look at the carbon cost of maintenance, it's slightly misleading. So we got some mowing contracts and we did some calculations. Mowing contracts are very accurate for numbers, and so they're really good. It costs more from a carbon perspective to mow a park 18 times a year than street clean a plaza of the same size 365 days a year. So when you think about carbon, we're looking into the wrong places. And of course, if you extract that out, I mean, we love, because we've picked up the English system, we love designing with English parks. And English parks, if you know anything about them, are highly, highly managed and manipulated and mown. And so the average small town in New Zealand mows about 13,000 hectares of lawn every year. 13,000 hectares of lawn for a small town is quite a lot of carbon. And this is where the tyranny of scale. So we look at the carbon-heavy plaza, but if you look at the entire landscape system as a carbon system, there's a lot of space for improvement in that system. So I had the good fortune of living in San Antonio for a few years, and what was really interesting about San Antonio, and this is one of my favorite open spaces, is Harburger Park was designed, and it had, I would argue, the same recreational values that our Hagley Park had in Christchurch, with no mown grass. There's no grass anywhere, but there's yoga and playgrounds and places to explore. There was camping. So there's more than one way to do things. And when you look at different ways of doing things, you can get a range of other really positive outcomes. And in this case, there was a whole ton of really positive outcomes from using a less European model and a more natural model, I guess. So, I think we have to say we have a carbon issue. So I took the liberty on your behalf to talk about a decarbonisation process for IFLA in 10 steps. So the first step to reducing our carbon footprint is to acknowledge that we have a carbon issue. And we have to address the carbon issue, which is a mitigation conversation, before we can start talking about adaptation. In the last 18 years of climate change conversations, 90% of them around our ability to deliver adaptation, that we are the best people and the profession to deliver adaptation from a climate change perspective, but I've heard very, very few conversations about reduction of carbon. You can't have adaptation without reducing your carbon. It's too cynical. We need the academic and the design community to work together. I've taught and I've worked, and I can't do what the academics do. The academics, you give them a problem, and they'll hone down on that with rigor. I don't have time to do that. However, I get to see a whole lot of landscape issues that they never see. And if we can come together and share information and, recognition, we could really start making some ground. Traditionally, in the last decade, I think intellectual and economic interests have really held us back. But if we could sort that out, we could really start making some ground. How do you fight climate change if carbon mitigation is not part of your education accreditation? How do we train the next generation of designers to understand the impacts of their work if it's not a requirement? So IFLA has the power to make carbon mitigation as part of your accreditation project would have a profound effect on the community. We need to start talking in a carbon design language. In the same way, and in many of the conversations I've just heard in the last couple of hours, we talk about culture, we talk about ecology, and we talk about water. I didn't hear carbon once. We talked about the old landscape architects. We talked about Pocock, right? He thought in layers. Where's the carbon? We need to change best practice to include carbon. We need to slow down the rate of urban renewal. We've got to stop it. We've got to think of different ways of producing high-quality spaces for people, and maybe more of gentle edits rather than bulldoze start again. I really think for the really, really big projects, the multi-million, billion-dollar projects, there should be external checks and balances to check those projects out before you spend that carbon debt. That is an intergenerational debt. I know that's not a popular idea as a designer. I don't want anyone giving me any checks and balances. But actually, if we're to be responsible, that is a pretty important step. And this is obvious. We need to decarbonize the way we manage land. There is a big difference between some landscape management types and others. And we need to start challenging the traditionally high carbon management types and start evolving to something else. I mean, we in New Zealand are fundamentally applying an 18th century landscape model, done it in a contemporary way, framed beautifully, but it's still an 18th century model with high carbon. And if we can make just a 10% change there, if we can make a 10% change and it gets multiplied across that scale of landscape, that's a significant change. The next three are a little bit uncomfortable. Then I'm done. If I can tell you anything that I've learned over the last 18 years, you can't tell a designer how to do anything. And so to get a designer to start thinking in a low carbon way is really difficult. But designers listen to the market and they'll listen to their clients. And so if we provide our clients low carbon approaches to RFQs, proposals, structures, the way we do specification and design standards, and they apply it to our community will follow suit. This is one of the most effective ways of getting us to reduce our huge carbon footprint. I want to be really clear. We have a large carbon debt, but it's unfair, and as a collective, however, the majority of our carbon debt is really specified by a few, a minority. We are not all equal in this conversation. If we want to make the quickest, and this is about speed, the quickest impact on the climate change by reducing our carbon footprint, talk to the high carbon consumers. Because not only do they have the ability to dial it back with better practice, but they also have the budgets to talk to the material industry, to start dialing back and getting different alternatives. We are at least a $20 billion industry, right? We specify into the material industry at least $20 billion internationally, and that will be conservatively low. If we started to behave like an environmentally friendly, and it should sound familiar, an environmentally friendly design practice, and we used our budget, our active market value to make change, the material industry will follow. Finally, to be an architect requires ego and recognition. You can't survive being a designer, fronting communities and politicians and all the rest without some sort of ego. And the quickest way to get a designer to tone down or detune their carbon is to add a clause into all awards that says demonstrate carbon minimization as a requirement. You would have a different focus on design approaches in the same that I saw in New York when the EDC required lower carbon approaches. And then we've got to be open to some conversations. And some conversations are easy and some conversations are hard. We need to understand the justification for spending intergenerational carbon debts on a single project. How do we justify this? So we, as a community, need to front up and have that's really cool, you did really good there, I don't understand what you're doing over there. How does this make sense? Because this is our collective carbon debt. So finally, we've got to start. Like, this has been a really long conversation. It's gone from, there's no way you're right, this can't be true. So that's kind of interesting, but we're not going to do anything about it, to, yeah, we really need to do something about it, but there's a whole lot of interest over here in adaptation, so we're just going to put a bit more time into adaptation over here. We'll deal with the carbon reduction and the mitigation later. We can't do that anymore. We are spending, the carbon debt we're spending right now is next generation's debt to pay back. And so you, as a collective, and as a governance collective, have a huge amount of power to turn around. And I haven't seen a lot of movement in 18 years, but I think if you took at least 3 or 4 of these ideas, we could do something. All right, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for your presentation, Mr. Parkok.